All right. Well, it's 5:32. Uh, don't want to delay any longer. People will continue to trickle in, which will be great. But let's hop right in. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the seventh session of Urge. It's so good to have you here with us for our session, Racism and Self-Care. My name is Gabriel Duran. I'm a former research assistant at the Woodwell Climate Research Center, or formerly known as the Woods Hole Research Center, and current graduate student at the University of Quebec in Montreal. As well, I'm a co-leader of the Urge team, and tonight I'll be your host. I want to acknowledge that I am on the traditional territory of the Mohawk and the Haudenosaunee people. Before we get started, the Urge team would like to take this opportunity to address current events centered around police brutality and anti-Asian American and Pacific Islander hate and violence. We want to acknowledge first that as BIPOC Urge leaders, we understand that it is exhaustive and frustrating to see that police brutality and racism is constantly on our social media, on our news feeds, news headlines, etc. We have to remind ourselves that these conversations aren't easy, and some people from the audience will likely be disproportionately impacted by these events, both mentally, physically, and emotionally. Now, when thinking of self-care, we want to be mindful that many of us may not have the capacity to discuss what is happening. So we want to take this moment to remind everyone why we made Urge. In 2020, in the wake of the killings of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and countless others, society understood that change needs to happen and that it is long overdue. We departed on this journey in the hopes to enact a movement and generate a community to truly work on unlearning racism in geoscience. Um, Although Urge should not exist. We would love for Urge to not need to exist. We would love for Vashan and myself and the rest of the team to not even have to sit on this and plan for months on end on how we can unlearn racism in our discipline. Nonetheless, here we stand this evening as a community unified around one common goal, and that is unlearning racism in geoscience. So for this week, although this session is geared towards discussing strategies that BIPOC geoscientists use or can use to deal with racism, we hope that there is very valuable information for everyone, including our white audience who do not experience racism. By being aware of these different coping strategies and mechanisms that people of color have to utilize in order to maintain self-care and mental health, our white audience can better understand in what ways their actions and words can trigger these strategies, or how current structures and systems that exist within your current institutions can be triggering to people of color. We ask you to listen carefully and intently to what the experts have to say tonight, and remember to center your pod meeting discussions around the readings, tonight's interview, and the deliverable for this week. Be mindful that people of color may not have the capacity to discuss or have conversations on this topic, that this is one coping strategy to resettle and to gather yourself, to digest. And most importantly, be mindful of the space you are sharing. Lastly, when working on your resource map, remember that these conversations are centered around racism and are meant to improve inclusivity for BIPOC geoscientists. Consider what your BIPOC members would need in order to feel welcomed and a sense of belonging to your community. We even suggest inviting people from outside your pod, maybe even outside your own department or from your community, to help with brainstorming what current resources exist in your environment and what is missing. And with that, we really hope you enjoy this session and think about these words that the Urge team wanted to leave with you. And to kick it right off, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Kimberly Trong. Dr. Trong is the Executive Director of Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the Massachusetts General Hospital Institute of Health Professions, a graduate school funded by the Mass General Hospital in 1977. Dr. Trong is an adjunct lecturer at education at Harvard Graduate School of Education, a faculty affiliate of the MGH Center for Cross-Cultural Student Emotional Wellness, and founder of XCM Consulting Services. Dr. Trong has received wide recognition for her work, and most recently, she was named the inaugural Rising Star Award recipient by the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education, and one of the 50 most influential people of color in higher education by Get Connected. She'll be giving a presentation on her paper, Responding to Racism and Racial Trauma in Doctoral Studies, an inventory for coping and mediating relationships. And with that, I'll pass it right over to you, Dr. Trong.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. Today I'm going to be talking about my dissertation study, which was, the title was Racism and Racial Trauma in Doctoral Study, How Students of Color Experience and Negotiate the Political Complexities of Racist Encounters. So it was driven by two different research questions. One was, what are the lived experiences of doctoral students of color with racism and racial trauma? And also the other one was, how do these students navigate, negotiate, and resolve the political complexities associated with these highly politicized racist encounters? And I came upon this dissertation study because I was sitting in my doctoral advisor's office and I was crying. I told him I was academically prepared to be here, but I wasn't prepared for the racism that I encountered in my doctoral program. And I said, I'm going to write that book. And so I actually ended up writing my dissertation on this topic, and I completed my PhD in 30 months, which is pretty much unheard of in a lot of the social sciences. So can you move on to the next slide, Matt? This is, I ended up being recognized by several different professional associations: Phi Delta Kappa, ARA, the American Psychological Association, and ASH, the Association for the Study of Higher Education. And this was my dissertation committee, but they were the folks that supported me while I was in my doctoral program: Dr. Sean R. Harper, whose work is on racism in higher education; Dr. Howard C. Stevenson, who I would definitely recommend in terms of reading about coping and responding to racism, and his research is on racial socialization and racial literacy. So he has a wonderful book and a TED Talk. And Dr. Bridget Terry Long, who's now the Dean of the Graduate School of Education at Harvard, who was my supporter as a master's student at Hugsy. She gave me a job. She advised and supported me. When I told her I wanted to pursue doctoral studies, she said, that's great. I'm going to write your letter of recommendation and I'm going to be on your committee. So even though she's an economist and her research was on financial aid policy, which is why I ended up enrolling in doctoral study and then changing my topic later on, she continued to stay on and support me. So the next slide, please, Matthew. And we can stay on the next slide for a while, but I've published 3 different articles based on my dissertation study. And what's really interesting about this work is that we know in doctoral education that attrition rates are the highest. So attrition rates are 50%. So even though doctoral students are the most academically prepared, they're also the most academically likely to leave their programs. And research and scholarship supports that students of color in graduate school have more barriers to success than white students do due to racism. So Sylvia Hurtado in 1994, as well as Danny Solorzano in his seminal work on introducing critical race theory as well as microaggressions to the higher education literature, they both suggest that we should learn more about how students navigate and negotiate through racism and hostile campus climate. So I conducted a phenomenological study using critical race theory as my theoretical framework, as well as Terry Yosa's 2005 Community Cultural Wealth article to frame some of my work from the question on how students experience racism and racial trauma. There were 12 different themes. They included loneliness and isolation, identity, intersectionality. So identity, intersectionality in the Black men in my study talked about being hyper sexualized as well as criminalized. And I remember also the women in my study who felt like they were younger or older were not seen as knowledge producers or knowledge bearers. Differential support and investment was the third theme. The fourth was low expectations and high standards. So low expectations is found widely in the literature, but high standards are the low expectations are, you don't belong here, but show me that you belong here. So the highest standards were coupled with that. The role of funding was used to marginalize students. Finding 6 was exploitation of students and asking them to appear in marketing materials and other things. 7 was neglect, and that's similar to the differential support and investment, whereas students of color mentioned how their advisors would support their white counterparts and not necessarily support them as much. The 8th theme was devaluing research on race. The 9th was the reproduction of racism by people of color. So most of the experiences that the doctoral students of color had in my study were from white individuals, colleagues and faculty members, but they also mentioned that there was some reproduction of racism by people of color as well too. The 10th theme was cumulative effects of racial microaggressions. So about all 26 participants experienced racial microaggressions in my study, but about half of them experienced more overt and intentional forms of racism, which led to theme 11, which was violations of institutional and federal policies, where ADA was broken, HIPAA, as well as FERPA laws were broken as well too. And the 12th theme was vicarious racism, which has really interesting characteristics that, and you can read about that in the International Journal for Qualitative Studies in Education article. So Matthew, can you go to the next slide? So in terms of how folks coped and respond to racial trauma, I used Miller's taxonomy of coping styles more loosely in that it was on a continuum, and there were 3 different groups. The first group was internal responses, so how they maintained well-being. Group 2 and group 3 were controlled responses, which were indirect responses, and group 3 were external responses, which were direct responses. And in groups 2 and 3, they were how they mediated relationships with other individuals. Participants in my study mentioned actually using multiple methods under each of these different groups, and it wasn't a one-size-fits-all, whereas some individuals, when they mediated relationships, used controlled responses and there were consequences for that. Other times it worked, and the same thing with those in group 3. But what was really important was the internal responses of being able to utilize social support and get help with coping among friendship groups as well as family. They also avoided racist environments. And it was like physical spaces where they mentioned that anytime they saw the building with the school building, or where they had to go to a certain floor there, they experienced severe pain. So they decided not to go to those spaces. They engaged in religion and spirituality. They also sought treatment by going to see physicians as well as therapists. And in some of the cases, they also mentioned those as sites where they experienced racism as well too. The 5th was achieving as resistance, which supports one of Sylvia Hurtado's findings in her research that when she looked at more hostile campus environments, she had assumed that the students would have lower self-academic concepts, but what she actually found was the students who experienced more hostile campus environments actually had higher self-academic concepts. And I feel like this finding is aligned with that. Advocating for peers and supporting them, founding student organizations to engage in resistance. And you can read more about the advocating for peers theme in the vicarious racism article. Relieving stress through hobbies. They mentioned kickboxing, playing with pets, yoga, soccer, etc. Reflecting through writing in journals and just thinking more about their own racialized experiences. And the 9th theme under internal responses was preparing for racist encounter. So knowing that anytime that they were going to enter spaces that they were going to experience racism, just help them to not, having lower expectations actually help them to not be surprised when they did encounter racism. Under controlled responses were suppressing reactions. So when they saw people act or say certain things, one participant stated, I smile and I keep it moving. Another participant talked about surveilling and profiling and using strategic maneuvering to strategize on how to respond so that the other person would respond in more positive ways, seeking intervention and asking other folks to help support them who are in positions of power, switching advisors. And that was done more indirectly in that the participants mentioned that they told their advisors that they were switching because of research alignment, as well as opportunities for funding. And the 5th one was transferring out, which is the most risky in that they could transfer out to another place that could also be hostile as well too, but the 2 participants in my study who ended up transferring out actually had positive experiences within their doctoral programs. The external responses included speaking up in the classroom and outside the classroom when they did encounter situations. They also documented and filed complaints. So there was one participant in my study who wrote, who showed me, like, I have like 3 large binders of materials where they documented everything. They filed whistleblower complaints, went to the ADA, Office of Students with Disabilities, and to others. And one participant actually sued the university, 2 others had attorneys, and one of the institutions actually settled with a student because they broke FERPA and HIPAA laws. And the third was restructuring committees, which is a little bit different than switching advisors in that they actually had to have a conversation with the committee members and fired them and told them the reasons why they ended up having to restructure their committees because of the extreme racism that they were experiencing. And so what I really found from this study was it helped me during my time in doctoral study. It was actually the highlight of my doctoral experience, being able to meet other students like myself who had experienced similar or different situations when it came to racism, and just seeing the common experiences that we had, but then also seeing that a lot of these methods in which they responded and they coped were things that they developed over time from when they were younger up until doctoral studies. So having all this practice and this knowledge to develop this repertoire of different ways in which that they could respond was really helpful to me. But I think now, as somebody who is an executive director of Justice, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, I think my role isn't like, this research was based on the experiences of students and the onus being on them on how to cope and respond. But as my role as an administrator is to make sure that there's support for students so they don't encounter racism and racial trauma. And we know that using critical race theory, that racism is always going to exist, but my job is also to make sure that their experiences are much more positive. So I will turn it back over to Gabriel. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about coping or just about justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, and higher education, how we can better support folks in the geosciences as they navigate to and through these spaces, because higher education is a microcosm of our society, and we see within our society like racism is endemic.
Thank you so much, Dr. Trong. That was great. I'm going to move over into our next speaker. I would like to introduce Dr. Delma Ramos. Dr. Ramos is a first-generation college student and first-generation faculty who currently serves as assistant professor of higher education at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Dr. Ramos's work examines the experiences of historically marginalized populations in higher education from an equity and social justice lens, and is unified by its focus on interrogating paradigms and ideologies that sustain inequity in higher education and highlighting assets, agency, and resistance of these communities. Currently, she is focused on investigating the influence of the Southern epistemology on the experiences of Latinx college students and their families residing in the Southeast region of the United States. Dr. Ramos earned a PhD in higher education with a concentration in research methods and statistics from the University of Denver. She'll be giving a presentation on her paper, Doctoral Women of Color, Coping with Racism and Sexism in the Academy. And with that, I'll pass it right over to Dr. Ramos. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. If I may have my presentation up, that would be great. Okay, well, first of all, thank you for having me. I am really excited to share a piece of my work. So this paper was done in collaboration with Dr. Baraksi, who is currently serving as assistant professor at Fresno State University. Just to give you a little bit more context as to how I got to this work, Dr. Yi and I were both doctoral students at the time that we started this project. Very much like Dr. Trong, we got to this work because of the experiences that we were having and our interest and curiosity in learning how fellow women of color in doctoral programs were navigating and experiencing those spaces. So the impetus for this paper, like I said, is stemming from personal experience. led us to a purpose of wanting to examine what experiences do women of color have in relation to racism and sexism in academic spaces, but most importantly, in alignment with wanting to highlight doctoral women of color agency in navigating oppression, we wanted to learn what navigational strategies they incorporated to address those incidents of sexism and racism. And then the rationale for examining sexism and racism came about because of these two being interlocking systems of oppression, right? Like you cannot separate one from the other, and women of color encounter themselves at the crossroads of these various systems of oppression for the purpose of my paper, Sexism and Racism. So there were two research questions that we intended to address. Number one, just exploring what experiences the women of color experience with racism and sexism in their academic environments, and in what ways do they respond to encounters with racism and sexism. This was a study located within the mountain region of the United States, but it included several institutions, which were 3 public and 1 private. And we ended up with a sample of 11 doctoral women of color. On the screen, you can see their ethnic identities from all of them. And they came from a variety of fields, but the majority of them came from education or education-related disciplines. So like educational leadership, urban ed, for example. In addition to that, Latina American women represented a greater number of participants in the study. All right, so when looking at the first research question, also like Dr. Trong and Dr. Mosellas, we relied on an existing taxonomy of responses and classification of experiences, so specifically Milor's 2004 taxonomy, which was derived from the work with Aboriginal Australians. And so we created or incorporated that taxonomy to allow us to also explore what experiences participants share with us. And so keeping in mind that some of the questions that we asked them require the participants to reflect how the systems of racism and sexism have shaped their experience generally, but they have also connected to their experiences in academia. We learned that participants experience 3 different types of incidents. The first one being covert or harder to notice, and sometimes, you know, even in well-intentioned encounters, they experience microaggressions or assumptions of them based on their gender, based on their race. Some examples of this one include being tokenized or being considered exotic because they were members of a racially minoritized community and they were young women. In addition to that, just having people express very gendered expectations of doctoral women of color. So for example, that they should be devoting more time to their families and not be pursuing advanced degrees. And then from that, overt experiences, represent those experiences where participants were blatantly, they experienced direct violence related to racism or sexism, and violence maybe not physically, but blatantly open. So for example, being called a dirty Mexican, which was one of the examples that a participant shared. Another example, xenophobic comments such as "go back to your country," conveyed to Native American participants. And then the last category was physical and material manifestations, which these were beyond just the messages the participants were given either explicitly or implicitly, right? With physical manifestations, we start to see tangible shifts. One example that I can share is one participant being more conscious about how she dressed in professional settings as to avoid over-sexualization of her body as a Latina, and that as a result of people making comments about her physical features. Another student, for example, being expected to work on a research project without compensation, when there were additional research assistants who were being paid for the same kind of work, but did not have a connection to the community that was at the center of the work. But yeah, let's be aware of those experiences, but let's shift to understanding the assets and the strategies that participants employed. So for these, similar to Dr. Trunk's and Moseyu's paper, there were 3 categories, so defensive, control, and direct. And so defensive strategies were more about preserving the self. Like what to do right now in the face of this racist or sexist incidents that will allow me to protect myself in a way, which included moving away from the situation, avoiding it. For instance, we had a participant that was consistently tokenized and sexualized, and but she was afraid that if she filed a complaint or spoke up about it, that she would lose her job, and she needed the paycheck. So she, instead of addressing that issue, she decided to find another job, and eventually she moved away from the situation. We had other participants that were aware of what expectations people had of them in the academy, and so the response to that was to challenge those expectations by achieving, by excelling, by demonstrating that they were not as people or society had framed them to be, especially in academic spaces. There is this very dominant discourse of deficit ideologies where students of color specifically are expected less of, academically speaking. The second category, control responses, participants here strategize a little bit more, also invested more energy and deciding what would be a more effective way of addressing the situation. So maybe, continuing in the work, and once they get to a point where they can affect greater change, or maybe they can empower their community to become more present on the college campus, as opposed to immediately addressing the situation, but also engaging in these strategies. Participants assess the potential ramifications of it, which in contrast to direct responses, participants in the moment address the incident. So for instance, a participant offered an example of where they were in a class and somebody made a comment that was problematic. And so the instructor and the participant, they looked at each other. The participant understood as, I will address it, and then she addressed that comment by questioning why their colleague had spoken about the idea in such a way. So having people interrogate their assumptions and why they thought that way. And then another example that I can share is one of our participants. She is the one that got asked to work on a research project without compensation. And after consulting with her peers, she decided to address the issue with the PI. It turns out that the participants spoke about how the PI might have not thought about them, like it wasn't their intention to further discriminate the student by assuming that they would be willing to work for free. But she decided to address it and to, in a way, educate the person that was causing this harm. So those are basically related to the classification of their experiences and navigational strategies, what our participants shared with us. But what I want to spend a little bit more time on is just what can we do with this information and how do we move forward from here? So first of all, our work calls for anti-deficit perspectives and approaches to working with students of color and doctoral women of color specifically, which involves creating and crafting a culturally relevant pedagogy and practice in the work with students to be aware that sexism and racism are well and alive in the academy. I mean, we know that the academy was built upon slavery and the forceful removal of indigenous communities. And so the academy is built on white supremacy and colonialism. So being aware of those systems, but also recognizing them when you see those occurrences and doing something about it, especially if you are in a role where you have authority and you have power, it is a responsibility to address these issues. But furthermore, learning from the strategies that students engage before, trying to figure it out on your own, how to address the issue. Students have been marginalized their entire lives, and they have navigated and they have overcome difficulties up until they got to grad school. So learning from them and how they were able to mobilize their agency and their resources, and then figure out how you as an educator can leverage those resources in higher education. And I will stop at that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to both of our speakers for your amazing talks this evening. And we're gonna shift gears real quickly to our inclusivity tip brought to you by Dr. Christopher Jackson, self-care, mental health, and social media. I do wanna note that a longer version of this video will be made available on the URGE website and on our YouTube channel after tonight's event. And please, if you have questions, drop them into the Q&A box function on Zoom, and we will try to answer them after the inclusivity tip. And I'll pass it over to you, Matt.
Hi, I'd like to start off by saying a big thanks to the organisers of URGE for inviting me to come and talk at one of the pods and be interviewed for that, with a focus on self-care. So we probably hear the term self-care quite a lot, and probably we have a vague understanding of what it means, but just to kind of formally define it, it's the individual actions that we can take to protect our physical and mental well-being, and also those actions can directly impact our immediate friends and family. So why should we care about self-care? Well, self-care is one way in which we can maintain high and positive standards of mental and physical well-being, and they are critical to just our general health and happiness, but also our ability to perform to the best of our ability, no matter what our form of employment is. There are obviously a number of challenges to our physical and mental well-being that require us to instigate self-care measures. And these can vary from acute kind of one-off incidents that happen to us, or from sustained pressures that are exerted on us physically and mentally by the nature of our jobs or the nature of the personal relationships we form at our jobs or just outside of our jobs in our personal lives. Self-care is really important. You know, I've got a busy job. I have a family with 3 daughters. And so there are a number of stresses, if you will, on my day-to-day life and stress points as well. So these kind of one-off incidents where we need to handle an incident directly there and then. So for me, one thing I find really important is self-care, which targets 2 things in particular. One is my physical well-being and the other one is my mental well-being. So in terms of the physical well-being, what I really value is exercise. So I like to keep active. I like to run. I like to cycle as well. That gets me out of the house. It brings me into another physical and mental space, which then when I return to my desk and I have to do some work, which I'm finding difficult or challenging, I come back to that feeling refreshed and feeling like unburdened from the initial feeling I had before I left the house to go for a run. So coming back, I feel more able and equipped to take on that work-related challenge. In many ways, even if you dislike exercise, if you are able to, and that's an important point because not everybody can exercise to the same degree for various reasons, it's a very good thing to do as part of just an overall self-care package. So even if you hate running, it would benefit you in a way. For me, what really helps me keep my mental well-being good around work is by having very clear goals and having a very clear definition for myself of what success looks for. I think in academia, success is often defined by the attainment of the most high achieving people, and they may have a unique set of personal circumstances that allow them to attain to those levels, and that might not be available to everybody. And therefore that definition of success is inappropriate then for a bunch of other people. So having a definition of success which you would be happy with if you attained, I think I find that very, very useful to feel like, okay, it's not just this to-do list gets completed. It's more it's broader than that. Like, this is what I would like to be as an academic, what I'd like to learn, you know, who I'd like to interact with, what I'd like other people in some ways to think about me in terms of my contributions, both just scientifically, but also in terms of, you know, broader considerations of research culture and research environment. Another example where mental health can be challenged is, you know, around social media, which again is great for mental health in a way, because it's a way or a place where historically excluded groups can go to find allies and find people with similar stories to them, and realize that they are not alone, and realize that things that have happened to them are not appropriate, and realize that there are things that can be done about that. And so I think social media is really good in that respect, and it also gives you autonomy over how you promote yourself and how you talk about yourself, and trying to get input on those things. But it can also be quite negative as well, of course. So you know, there's good things and bad things, and discriminatory behavior is everywhere, and social media is no exception to that. And so for me, you know, like I've experienced racist aggressions against me on social media. For example, last year when it was announced I was going to give one of these Royal Institution Christmas lectures, and I did a few interviews in support of that. And an important part of that story was, you know, there'd been no Black lecturer giving that talk for 185 years. And so that was a part of the story. And obviously that triggered negative reactions in a number of white people who felt that I was only chosen because I was Black and I didn't have the professional qualifications to give this lecture. I think I am in a space where I do not get personally harmed by it. You know, it bothers me. I think it's not very nice. But immediately my action is to firstly try and educate those people to see if there's any way in which they would change their point of view if they knew why what they were saying was incorrect. I think as well, you know, reporting those people is really important. So in that case, the Royal Institution lectures, reporting them to the police actually made me take back some power. I felt like I was doing something positive, not necessarily just for myself, but for, you know, reporting of racist incidents, I think is really important so people know how. So it made me feel like I was doing something positive from a deeply negative interaction. So I think that's an important thing as well. Again, for me, and again, it's not for me to tell everybody how to react to these sorts of situations, but for me, it's to take control of that situation. Because there are coping mechanisms which would actually propose that you remove yourself from those situations immediately from harm. And after the incident, distance yourself as best as you can from that. And in some degree, I probably do. I go cycling or running to forget something not very nice that happened. But I'm the sort of person who likes to kind of stay in the trenches, if you will, and actually engage in some of these discussions. Because I think, especially on social media, it's a way of other people sort of witnessing the reality and the severity of racist incidents, and therefore maybe in the future them being better equipped to be better allies, or for Black people, say, seeing coping mechanisms and seeing ways in which they can turn these negative experiences into something positive. So thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure to speak to you.
All right. Thank you. We'll move right into questions. Again, please feel free to continue dropping your questions into the Q&A box function, and we'll try to answer them as they continue to come in. But this question specifically has been answered already, but I think it's a really important question that we should also answer live and make available to both Dr. Ramos and Dr. Trong. And the question is, how do we get those more privileged than us, those who haven't experienced these interlocking systems of oppression, to walk in our shoes and really understand or have empathy for how much harder it is for students of color to go through and be successful in the academy? Of course, storytelling helps, but what else can make them understand? And especially for those who aren't in spaces like URGE.
I can answer this briefly. I'm actually working on a piece right now that it's a theoretical paper about allyship, especially allyship from white identified colleagues. And in that paper, which I think a part of your question is gonna have to tie it back to this idea of examining our own complicity within systems of oppression. So how are we a part of a system that continues to perpetuate structural violence against people from minoritized identities? So for instance, what privilege do I have that keeps me from ever thinking about when am I gonna eat? Do I have a roof over my head? Am I gonna be racially profiled today? Right, so understanding what privileges we have and what roles we play, I often think about it in my role as faculty. How am I as faculty and the practices that I employ in the classroom perpetuate, for example, individualistic ideas, deficit-based ideas? How am I fostering competition instead of collaboration? How are grades a tool for preserving this idea of individualistic gain and excellence in higher education? So one thing that I would recommend is examine what role you play and in what ways can you utilize that privilege that you have to support your colleagues that don't have access to those resources. So for instance, you are more financially stable and you're able to devote some of your time to a local food pantry, or you make donations to a cause that's going to help uplift communities that are historically marginalized. So start with examining how you're complicit in it, and then figure out what resources you have your colleagues who are marginalized don't have, and identify ways that you can then reallocate some of those resources to support them. But at the same time, and I just like to say is one more thing, traditional notions of allyship are really closely linked to feeling good about helping somebody. And a lot of times then that makes this work that we say we're doing as allies about ourselves, about feeling maybe less guilty for, having more privilege or, access to networks or resources. So another point that I like to highlight is when you are an ally to somebody, ask yourself, what's the impetus for you to becoming an ally? Is it something just to perhaps appear like you're very committed or make you feel better? Or is it that you're truly committed and willing to give up some of those extra resources that you have?
And related to ally too, I had a conversation several years ago when I was Director of Inclusion Programs at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. And one of my colleagues and I were talking about allyship, and I remember them saying ally is a verb, it's not a noun, right? So you just don't declare that you're an ally, but you have to have receipts for it, right? So in terms of thinking about when we're talking about having others learn about these issues, and we're in institutions of higher education, to make sure that there's accountability involved with it too, right? So last year, all of these institutions were making statements in June, but were there also action plans in place? And then making sure that the work that we're doing is mission aligned, because all of these institutions have a diversity mission, and we need to make sure that we're capacity building to be able to engage in this work with members of the community, faculty, staff, and students. So when I think about faculty, the work that we're doing at MGH-IHP right now is we're helping our faculty to audit their syllabi, and then to look at it in terms of like JEDI content, justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, because we've moved beyond DEI now to JEDI and making sure that we're leading with justice and equity. And there's accountability involved in terms of being able to account for this during your annual performance review, right? Because I think there's been work by like Sean Harper and Anthony Antonio that says, we have to be accountable to ourselves as student affairs administrators, as well as Sean Harper and Stephen Quay, who talk about it in terms of faculty. But when there's actually accountability involved, that's institutional sanctioned, I think that's really important for us to be able to do that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, perfectly. And I'm just going to jump right into the next question. And this is a question to both speakers tonight. The question is asking for advice about how to find support and feel like you matter when you are, quote, a temporary student fighting against tenured faculty who are more concerned about their ongoing working relationships with faculty than really changing the system or backing students. And just more broadly, a lot of the discussions tonight are centered around doctoral students. How can we more broadly extend this to support both undergraduate students of color and or faculty/staff of color?
I think to address partially the first question about temporary student, I think that a big part of that is understanding just historically what higher education, where it came from, and who higher education was built for and designed for. And also understanding that by simply being present in these spaces, you're disrupting that traditional narrative of who should be and should not be there. And your presence there, symbolic, powerful, it matters. And when it comes to power dynamics, I think something that's been helpful for me is to be aware of what resources I have access to, whether it is on campus or off campus within the larger community, especially my support networks that can help me navigate and decide what ways I could address those power dynamics that are impacting me negatively.
And I think for me, I would add too, in terms of undergraduate students, making sure that there are spaces for them, like cultural houses and counseling and psychological services. Because we saw last week or the week before at Harvard, it went viral where there were supposed to be resources for anti-Asian racism, but it actually perpetuated anti-Asian racism. So making sure that providers also have the knowledge to engage in support of students. And then we also know from faculty members of color, they're doing an exorbitant amount of invisible labor and they're not being acknowledged for it. And institutions need to be able to acknowledge that through work planning as well as tenure and promotion processes too. And make sure that they have the support that they need. So in terms of like negotiating, like for startup packages, perhaps they could include mentorship and having a person of color from external to the institution as well as internal to help support them throughout in transitioning to their new positions. And I'm really sorry about my video. There's something wrong with it where it's not showing, but I'm here and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you to you both. And I think this next question is also, again, another more general question to both you, Dr. Trong and Dr. Ramos. And the question asks for your, I guess, personal opinions or your advice on what are some good ways of responding to racism in that, what did the people in your research find to work well? Or are these really, a good set of strategies? And many times these strategies just do not work. And what do you do then? Do you just leave?
I think for me, the strategies that work well are the ones under column 1 because they're to maintain well-being. I think strategies under groups 2 and 3 where it wasn't one size fits all and sometimes it doesn't work and sometimes it does. And it really depends on the context. Just in terms of thinking about my own experiences in doctoral education, I was not going to leave doctoral study without a degree, right? So I decided that I needed to leave as soon as possible. So that's what I did in those 30 months to get my PhD. But they weren't like, I think for faculty or those who are in like staff positions in education, as somebody who advises staff and has had years of advising staff, I do recommend if things aren't working out in the workplace and that they are experiencing a hostile environment, what I did was connect them with other recruiters across campus to, because it was such a large university, to be able to connect with folks to see if there were other positions, because that is probably perhaps the easiest thing to do. But when you're in a faculty position, it's very hard to find that. So I think with faculty, it's raising awareness that faculty as a whole are having these racialized experiences, and for us to support them. At the MGH IHP, when I mentioned invisible labor, this is something that has been, like the literature shows, like 30 years of this. No institution has solved this problem. We had conversations about it with Black faculty in our School of Nursing, and we developed a proposal, and it recently got approved. So I'm in the process of writing about that, but we're taking invisible labor into account during the work planning process. So I think being able to find allies who are in positions like diversity offices to be able to develop policies and practices that will then help impact the entire institution, I think is helpful. But then also they'll help you with navigating individual situations. But when they also finding support to know that you're not just the only person having this experience, and making sure that you can organize as a group, I think will also be helpful to then get your voices out there to get support.
And I will just add to that. I think I lost my train of thought. Can you remind me of the question, please, before I?
Yeah, the question was more so on your personal advice on these strategies, whether or not, what happens if they don't work.
Got it. Yes. Yeah, so I was going in the right direction. So these responses, personally for myself and also for the participants in our study, are highly shaped by the context and situational awareness. So it might not be feasible to all the time be addressing the incident right away. And perhaps we're not in a physical and mental state to address it, and the best thing for us to do to continue on is to just walk away from it for now and then figure out what to do about it. As a faculty, I gotta say, when I see these things, I find myself addressing them more directly. It's more risky for me because I don't have tenure yet. I'm only a third-year professor, so 3 more years to go. But I still have to do it, and perhaps I don't say it loudly. This is an issue. For instance, at some point we had a committee where a student was a student of color, a woman of color, and a faculty from outside our department wanted to have the student conducting the dissertation have another woman of color help with coding, because the woman of color shared the same racial identity with the student that was carrying out the dissertation, and therefore could validate the dissertation findings. That was highly problematic on many levels, ethically, you name it. I addressed it immediately. I spoke about the ethical concerns, and also not only the tokenism that was in play, but also just the fact of questioning our students' ability to conduct a dissertation on their own, which, dissertation is your solo project. But I like I said, it is highly situational. At that time, I had authority sitting on this committee, so I could do it. Had I not been a part of this entity, perhaps I would have gone out and talked to somebody and then just mentioned, I heard about this, maybe you can address it. But I had to do it. So situationally speaking, those responses will vary, and their effectiveness as well.
Thank you. And this next question, again, is to both of you. And I think it's a very important question to our URGE audience, because I'm sure, as we are all familiar with a lot of these institutions, these processes can be very bureaucratic and can be a pain to deal with. And I'm sure a lot of URGE pods have dealt with this in some form. But the question asks, when working with university governments or student governments, what strategies do you pursue when the organization has already done bias training and received pushback from anti-racist actions, either because university regulations have their hands tied or they think that anti-racist policies would alienate parts of the student body? And when you're doing this work, how do you protect yourself from the stress of this political process when leaders are strategically delaying the change?
I have the privilege of working with the student government president because she's also one of the JEDI fellows in my office. We pay graduate students to be a part of this cohort-based experience where we provide leadership development opportunities for them as well too, and they engage in some of the solutions that they see for the issues as they relate to JEDI. I think I'm really lucky to be at MGH-IHP where the pushback isn't about this is too much like anti-racism work, but I think the faculty who I've worked with have been afraid to speak up because they don't want to make mistakes. And so there's this culture of perfectionism where folks don't even start having the conversation because they want to be perfect. And so for me, like some of the conversation has been with them is, let's talk about making mistakes as part of the learning process and normalize that, right? Let's talk about feeling uncomfortable as part of the learning process when it comes to justice, equity, diversity, inclusion issues. I think also being somebody who's an administrator, I don't play a compliance role at all within my institution, which is really helpful because what I'm trying to do is like our mission is advancing care in a diverse society. And how are we supposed to do that if our students aren't learning the content that they need to be able to serve all of the patients that they will be serving as health professionals? So the resistance I have is a little bit different in that I think everybody, like at my institution now, like everybody's on board. And prior to that, they were really feeling uncomfortable because they weren't used to having these conversations and weren't used to feeling uncomfortable and were afraid of making mistakes. But now that we've normalized it, things have been a lot better. I don't know, Delma, do you have any thoughts on this?
I don't have any specific answer to this question. It's actually very complex, and we're actually experiencing something similar here on campus with trying to address racism among faculty. Right? There's a lot of pushback, but what I've observed the leadership do is if the one approach that was proposed was pushed against and it didn't move forward, can we start with maybe smaller things and try to secure the buy-in of people progressively as opposed to try to have a massive immediate change where we know people are not ready for or feel insecure about or threatened by it. So creatively think of how can you circumvent some of that resistance and still do some of that work that you need to begin that transformation.
And another thing I forgot too is we've developed a common vocabulary among the members of our community to define what equity is, and sometimes equal is not equitable, right? So just to help people better understand that the policies that we're working on are to create more equity because of the lack of inequity that has existed for so long that we were okay with, and now why are we not okay with moving towards equity? So then also having those conversations too, in terms of the faculty labor piece that we're acknowledging, that's actually not going to take away from white faculty as well too, because we have institutional financial resources to devote to hiring term lecturers to support the courses that the faculty of color are reducing because of that we are acknowledging their invisible labor. So that's been really helpful, is to get the institutional resources and commitment in place. So I think being in these types of institutions, you need leadership that are committed. And you need administrators who are committed, and faculty and staff and students too, to be able to be open to learning. And they all don't necessarily have to know all this content now, but it's just being open to having these conversations and developing this common vocabulary and this culture where they're not, where they're they're open to justice and they're open to equity.
Thank you, both speakers, Dr. Trung and Dr. Ramos, for amazing discussions and for answering all of our questions. But just being aware of time, it's 6:32, so we'll be closing up. Just a reminder to pod leaders, don't forget to schedule your pod meetings and your deliverables, and submit them to the URGE website. And again, thank you for joining all of us. We'll see you at our last URGE session, session 8, Racism and Accountability. Again, thank you for joining us. Bye, everyone.